Thank you so much for coming out on this sort of wet and windy, very windy day. Yeah, my name's Lee Jackson. I am interested in Victorian London. I've been doing Victorian things for quite a while. I've written three books now for Yale University Press. I've got a big website called victorianlondon.org. If you want to sort of research Victorian London, delve down to that. It's about 20 years old now, but there's thousands of pages of sort of social history buried in there. But today, I'm going to talk about Dickens London as a tourist attraction. So this is not, I'm not giving you a tour of Dickens London today, even a virtual tour. I'm talking about the history of people looking at places in Dickens London, reading about them as well, reading up on them, buying books on them, visiting them as tourists. And that's a history which goes back basically to just after Dickens' death. So there's a 150-year history. Dickens died in 1870. There's a 150-year history of Dickensian tourism in London. And probably the peak of it was around about sort of 1890 to 1930, thereabouts. But of course, it continues to this day. And that's why I kind of wanted to investigate it. What have people been looking at? Has it always been the same thing? Why do people want to find the real places that we read about in imaginary books? So the first Dickens tourist, and if anyone can correct me on this, I would love to know if there's anyone earlier, but I'm pretty sure the first Dickens tourist is actually Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. A couple of years before she wrote that famous book, she was on a tour of Europe. It wasn't her tour. She was the sort of helper to an invalid family friend, being sort of like nursemaid to her. And she therefore, as part of that, she got a free tour of Europe in the bargain. And she was a massive fan of Dickens. She could recite sections of the books by heart. She adapted them for amateur theatricals. She even had a fondness for Dickensian catchphrases. One acquaintance recalled that her assent always took the form of "Barkis is willing," which is from David Copperfield. I doubt she always said that when someone asked her something, but there you go. And she was chaperoned around London when she was there on this sort of grand tour of Europe by a fellow American, a guy called Moses Coit Tyler, who would later become the first US professor of American history at Cornell University in the US. And she writes of her experience of touring around places she'd read about in Dickens's novels as a sort of barely fictionalized short story called A Dickens Day. And she writes about in her diary, and as I think we've got a little quote here, "I felt as if I'd got into a novel." So it's quite interesting that the first tourist of Dickens London was American, because Americans have always been the greatest enthusiasts for Dickens London, much more than anyone in the UK. But it took a little while for Dickensian tourism to catch on. So she was there in 1866. Dickens dies in 1870. You get one travelogue sort of guidebook called Dickens London, published in 1876. But that was described by one reviewer as a reverential, but as far as we can see, useless piece of work, which is quite a harsh review, really. But from 1880, it sort of all changes. What becomes like it starts off as a real sort of trickle of publications, this one book, and then suddenly you start getting dozens upon dozens of magazine articles, newspaper articles, several books per year, normally 2 or 3, maybe sometimes 4 or 5, running right through into the 1920s. It becomes a real sort of London tourist industry. So who was writing the actual literature? Oops, sorry, gone too far, go back. This is just a small sample. Some of them were literary acolytes of Charles Dickens. So Percy Fitzgerald, who we can see on the right there, born in 1830, died in 1925, so a very long-lived young fellow. But he met Dickens when he was young. He wrote for Household Words and All the Year Round, Dickens's magazines. And he was a big creator of these articles about Dickens London and places he knew from Dickens. But there were other journalists. The first guy to do a print series on Dickens London was a gentleman called John R.G. Hazard, who was an American. He was the literary editor of the New York Tribune, and he came to London in 1879, and wrote a series of articles for the newspaper. There were professional tour guides. A gentleman called Robert Albert wrote books in the 1880s. The main one was London Rambles on Zigzag with Charles Dickens. And he was working for a London travel agency at the time. And if you look at the back of the book, there is an advert for his tour guiding. So Dickens' walks were happening in the 1880s. We know that for certain. And there's more widely what was called at the time, rather ominously, the Dickens cult, which is just a word for fans, basically. The newspapers coined in the 1880s. And so you have a couple here on the left, William R. Hughes. His day job, he was, I think, treasurer for the city of Birmingham, but it was a massive collector of Dickensiana and memorabilia and Dickens things, and he's very interested in writing up at these sort of walks around London he was doing. Frederick Kitten was an illustrator, an author. He wrote several books on Dickens, and they did one book together for which they did this little photograph. And it's meant to be slightly comical that they're going on a trip across the Alps. That's why he's got a little sort of ice pick there and this sort of walking gear, whereas in fact it was a walk around London and Kent. So it's a little in-joke for them. And then I've also got here I mainly have this guy for the amazing mustachios. This is Joseph Ashby Sterry, who was a journalist, I think very well off. He had a flat overlooking Trafalgar Square, so it gives you some idea maybe. He wrote lots of pieces about Dickens London. He had a regular newspaper column he wrote about Dickens London. He was a contributor to Punch, and he wrote some very, very amateurish poetry. I wouldn't recommend it. But he also, according to his obituary in the Dickensian, he actually coined the term Dickensian. Allegedly, before that it was Dickensonian. So we could have gone with Dickensonian, but for some reason we didn't. So there's all these people writing these bits of walk with me around Dickens London, take a jaunt around the places that Dickens describes or the places that Dickens knew. And you see that even from the 1880s, but there's a lot more than that as well. There are actual tours, as I've already mentioned. One I really find interesting is there's a group called the Lady Guides Association, who were formed, I think, 1889 by an Edith Davis. And they were basically female tour guides or chaperones for visiting tourists who would come to London. So an American lady might be, she'd go across the Atlantic, she'd book into the Savoy or wherever, and she wants to see London, get taken around the shops. And they would hire one of the lady guides from the Lady Guides Association. And they were intelligent gentlewomen, as they were advertised, they knew all about Dickens because they knew that American tourists were interested in Dickens. They were acquainted with every single place of which mention is made in the great novelist's works, which is quite an achievement because there's quite a lot of places. They also did, can you believe this, tours of Jack the Ripper's London, lady tour guides for lady tourists as early as 1890, so 2 years after the murders. So there were tour guides of various sorts. There were public speakers, the very debonair gentleman you see here, Frank Oak Rose. He was a speaker in New York in the 1880s, and he would have been using magic lantern slides. So we'd have a grand stage set up in the New York Theatre, and they would have slideshows of places in Dickens London, shots of contemporary London, shots of illustrations from the novels. And there were lots of people using magic lantern slides doing this sort of thing. He was a particularly famous example in New York, but any village hall in the 1880s, 1890s, there'd always be a magic lantern show every other week. And these would be touring showmen, basically, who'd bring around their sets of slides. And one of the sets, several sets you could buy were slides of Dickens London. You would probably buy them from the publisher, and they'd probably also supply the text, and you would go in the village hall or wherever, and you would show these things. So Dickens London was being displayed in slideshows, as we are now, in the 1880s. And there were films. There was a film called, once you get to the 20th century, there was a film called Leaves from the Books of Charles Dickens, which is 1912, which is again someone walking around Dickens London, showing you the existing site. No print of that survives, but if you go to BFI Player, which is available online from the British Film Institute, you can find Dickens London 1924 film, which again takes you around Dickens London in the 1920s. And there were other odd sort of visual media and ephemera as well. So we've got here, on the right here, we're looking at cigarette cards. And these were collectible sets of Dickens London cigarette cards. I think there were two different sets from the 1920s. There were also posters and paintings. London Underground did a couple of Dickens posters. You may have seen them in the London Transport Museum. And so it's all incredibly popular. It's not just about people doing guidebooks and walking tours. And it does taper off in the 1920s. But as I say, there is Dickens tourism still to this day. And basically in this lecture, I'm going to focus on three interesting sites, which I think sort of tell us a little bit about it and its history. One that has survived, one that's been demolished, and well, I'm going ahead of myself. Let's actually have a look at what we're talking about. So I'm going to start with a good place to start, I think, Coaching Inns and the Pickwick Papers. Dickens begins really his literary career in seriousness after he published various sort of sketches, which were put together sketches by Boz, but in 1836 he begins the Pickwick Papers, his first novel. And it's a book which is particularly remembered, and it was remembered in the 19th century as well for its portrayal of coaching inns. And this was a very interesting period for transport. Coaching inns, you had improved coaches with better springs, you had new road surface being laid between cities, competition between lots of rival coaching companies. So by the 1830s, you could reach an average of 8 miles per hour on the main lines between, say, London and Bath. Now, that may not sound like much, but that was actually a big improvement. But yes, unfortunately, of course, for those in the coaching business, exactly in this period, when Dickens is writing the Pickwick Papers, something else on the horizon, the railway. The first railway line in London from Deptford to Spa Road in Bermondsey that opens a month before the first episode of Pickwick is published. London Bridge and Euston are opened during the publication of the Pickwick Papers. So Pickwick comes out at the sort of peak point of coaching, at the point when it actually starts to decline. And what happens in the decades afterwards is that the coaching inns begin to close down. Some get sort of recycled by road hauliers. They're used as sort of like depots for wagons and goods. Including railway freight. It often gets sent onto an old coaching inn and then redistributed further on. And that way, many get demolished. And by the end of the 19th century, the Pickwick Papers sort of increasingly remembered for being actually a historical record of the coaching and sort of late Victorian. The late Victorians see the Pickwick Papers themselves quite nostalgically. By the 1880s, 1890s, people talk about those old coaching days as sort of this fondly remembered past that's now vanished. And they see Dickens and Pickwick as this nostalgic sort of history, really, of the coaching. And Dickens sees this coming. That's one of the interesting things. When he's writing the novel, he's already nostalgic about coaching inns. So I'm just going to read you a little passage from the Pickwick Papers. In the borough especially, there still remain some half dozen old inns which have preserved their external features unchanged and which have escaped alike the rage for public improvement and the encroachments of private speculation. Great rambling queer old places they are, with galleries and passages and staircases wide enough and antiquated enough to furnish materials for 100 ghost stories, supposing we should ever be reduced to the lamentable necessity of inventing any, and that the world should exist long enough to exhaust the innumerable veracious legends connected with the old London Bridge and its adjacent neighbourhood. So he already sounds nostalgic about this idea of the coaching inn in 1837 as he's writing it. And it's just fascinating, I think, he talks about the threat of public improvements and the encroachments of private speculation. I mean, isn't that just the history of London for the last 200 years? So no surprise then that when the Dickens tourism boom begins at the end of the century, coaching inns are an object of fascination, right? And the obvious place to explore for Dickens fans is Southwark, and in particular the White Hart Inn, which is the place where Mr. Pickwick meets the precocious boot cleaner Sam Weller, who becomes his trusted friend and servant in the book, and is kind of the book's breakout comic character as well. And again, Dickens describes this scene in some detail. Just again, a short passage. So this is describing the interior of the coaching inn where he meets Sam Weller. A double tier of bedroom galleries with old clumsy balustrades ran around two sides of the straggling area, and a double row of bells to correspond, sheltered from the weather by a little sloping roof hung over the door leading to the bar and coffee room. 2 or 3 gigs and chaise carts were wheeled up under different little sheds and penthouses, and the occasional heavy tread of a cart horse or rattling of a chain at the farther end of the yard announced to anybody who cared about the matter that the stable lay in that direction. So Dickens lays it on. He describes the coaching inn in great detail. He gets very nostalgic about it, even 1837, and so tourists, of course, want to find it. So Alfred Rimmer, for instance, the author of About England with Dickens, in 1883, he goes and visits the White Hart Inn, the place which Dickens writes about in the Pickwick Papers. He finds the remains of the inn quite satisfying. He describes the Dutch tiles on the roof. They're eminently picturesque. And he talks about the sort of curious relics inside. There's the inn's common room for guests, which contains a fireplace several centuries old and a groined apartment that certainly dates back to the time when Canterbury pilgrims used to rest here. And he gets quite interested in the place. It's a bit sad that part of the ground floor's been converted into a restaurant, but he has a snack anyway. Steak and chops of the very best, and a dinner of half a grouse with bread sauce for 18p, including the vegetables. So he's quite pleased. And this is Mr. Rimmer writing in the 1880s. But then as this article goes on describing the inn, it takes a darker turn. Half the ground floor has been taken over apparently by a curer of bacon. And we can see that here. That's the bacon curer's shed in the corner there. He notes that the galleries and the rooms have been converting into shoddy flats for the poor. So it's not an inn anymore. It hasn't been in for some time. The stables are in ruin. The yards had these sort of wrecks of old carts in them. It seems like this place is really in decline and its days are numbered. So he starts off all evocative, and by the end of it, he feels quite sad about it. Percy Fitzgerald, the guy I showed you at the start, he comes the next year. He also describes the inn, paints a very similar picture. He talks about the bacon dryer shed again and the washing lines strung across the yard and the squalid women hanging about the galleries. And overall, he says the place is black, grimed, rusty, and decayed. So it's fascinating. At the very start of Dickensian tourism, you get these two guys who come to look for something, and they come away kind of disappointed. It's a long way, actually, from the jolly world of Mr. Pickwick. It's Dickensian, but not in the right sense. It's the slum Dickensian rather than the jolly 1830s Dickensian. And certainly by 1889, the place is literally falling down. And it gets torn down in 1889. It's replaced by a hops store. Southwark, of course, has a long history with brewing. And the inn basically vanishes. And I think there's still a little lane called White Hart Yard now, but that's about it. So how did Dickensian tourists, and there were lots of them by this stage in the late 1880s already, how did they cope with this disappointment of the vanishing White Hart Inn, which anyway only had a bacon dryer shed and wasn't very Pickwickian? They went down the road. A few doors down was the George. The George Inn was another coaching inn. It dates back, the current iteration at least, dates back to 1676, rebuilt after the Great Fire of Southwark, which had destroyed the White Hart. So both of them were rebuilt in 1676 along basically sort of traditional lines. The George, however, had also been affected by the coming of the railways. It had been sold to St Thomas's Hospital in 1849, who had demolished the stables at the rear, and the remaining section they then sold to the Great Northern Railway in 1874, and they used it as a goods yard. But they did keep the pub. They kept the pub on one side of this galleried sort of coaching inn. And Alfred Rimmer, the guy I was talking about, he pops into here after he's been into the White Hart and finds it scrupulously clean and always whitewashed. Very neat. Fitzgerald likewise, Percy Fitzgerald, he talks about his bright and bustling air of business. And so basically, if you're looking for a Pickwickian coaching inn in the borough, the George was a distinctly better possibility. Not least because by the 1890s, it was the last man standing. There weren't any other coaching inns left. And it becomes a Dickens tourist destination. The only problem was that it had very little to do with Dickens. There's a single sentence in Little Dorrit where the possibility of someone having gone into the George to write a letter is mentioned. That's it. And yet, nonetheless, Dickensian tourists flocked here. Here's some American tourists from about 1900 having their photo taken outside the George. Joseph Ashby Sterry, the guy I showed you with the mustachios at the start, he claimed that Dickens actually had the George in mind when he was writing the Pickwick Papers, even though he talked about the pub 3 doors down, which seems somewhat unlikely. But also the pub's manager, who was a certain Amelia Dyer, who was succeeded by her daughter Agnes in 1903. So along several decades of the Dyer family owning the pub, or at least being the managers, they played at the Dickens connection something rotten. Geraniums, Dickens's favourite flower, were generally lining the balconies. Agnes, who showed the tourists the very bedroom in which characters from the Pickwick Papers had met. The very bedroom, mind, as if it was an actual real people, and she maintained the pretense of as if it was real people. She herself was an old lady by the sort of 1910s, 1920s. She had a sitting room filled with old photographs and memorabilia. She would get out the pewter from the pub, the old postboys' pistols, the trade bills, these various bits and pieces. And she told visitors that Dickens had a favourite table where he used to sit in the corner. It's not impossible. Adverts for the pub boasted of its Dickensian connection, of course. So this is one from the 1920s. Dickens knew the worth of real comfort and good fare. Try them yourself at a Dickens inn. Good bedrooms, excellent cooking and English meat. Retired, quaint, old-fashioned, yet close to modern business needs. So Dickens was being used for advertising. And in the 1920s, Agnes sort of solidified this relationship with Dickens by encouraging a group called the Tabard Players. They're fascinating. I wish I knew a bit more about them. They were a local theatre group, amateur actors, and every year they would put on a performance of a Dickens play generally, but not always, in the yard of the George. And basically medieval fashion, plays were often put on in coaching in yards in the medieval period, so they sort of reintroduced this oldie-worldy thing, and they would have it every year. Newspapers always took photographs. If you look at every newspaper, sort of every year, sort of round around Dickens' birthday, there's always photographs of the tabard players. So it was good publicity as well. And yeah, it worked for both, I suspect. But did Dickens have any connection? No, he didn't really, as far as we know. The owners have always tried to sort of fudged it a little bit. So it's owned by the National Trust. It has been owned by then since, I want to say 1939. I think that's right. And they've fudged it. So Dickens, the National Trust have, I think it's on their website, it says something like, Dickens knew the hospitality of this inn. So did he know of it? Did he stay there? I mean, no one can be absolutely sure, of course. I don't think it matters. It's not, it's not a fraud. It's a genuine historic coaching of exactly the sort that Dickens was thinking about. It's his redolent of the Pickwick Papers and its era. It's not a deception. But the next thing I want to talk about is something that takes it a distinct step further, really. So I'm going to talk about Nancy's Steps. I think we can pinpoint a particular publication that made Nancy's Steps a tourist destination. It was Joseph Ashby Sterry, that mustachioed gent again, and he has an article called Dickens in Southwark in 1888. And he describes how to find Nancy's Steps. He says, descend the steps to the river, hard by the Bridge House Hotel, and you will find yourself in the exact spot with precisely the scenery of half a century ago of the interview between Nancy, Rose Maylie, and Mr. Brownlow. If you go there about 12 o'clock on a dark night, you will realise the picture to perfection. So he's talking about London Bridge steps, and he's talking, of course, about Oliver Twist. And there's a meeting in Oliver Twist at London Bridge, and why not see where it actually happened? And the article, which I've take a little picture of here, it's an interesting article. So it sort of encapsulates the appeal of literary tourism. He says, it's like a guided tour in the article itself. He says, take my arm, trust in me, and I will personally conduct you around Dickensland. It's also this informative antiquarian experience. He says, if you go to this place, you will see the London of 50 years ago, as it still survives. And I think we all want to do that sort of step back in time. And it is that thing, so you can step back in time. You can literally be a time traveller. I think that's one of the great appeals of literary tourism, generally. And he even suggests that the reader could, I quote, lurk round the pilaster at the bottom of the flight of steps and play at being Noah Claypole. Now, Noah Claypole in the novel is Fagin's spy who sees what's going on. And so he says, imagine yourself like a character in the novel. You can actually live it in 3D, just walk down these steps. So it's great. And he also says at 12 o'clock to go there because the meeting happens at midnight in the book. It happens in the middle of the night. And you've got this image as well. It's interesting, you've got the image and the text sort of intermingle in this sort of dreamy way as well. So you get all this sort of like virtual experience almost he's promising. So this was the first article that got people interested in Nancy's Steps, and tourists started to visit London Bridge Steps. It was not only articles, there was other sort of representations. This is, sadly I haven't got the colour version here, but this is the poster for the 1905 theatre adaptation of Oliver Twist. And the main image they used, and this has been all put throughout London, was the Nancy's Steps scene. And the reason was because in this theatre production, they did this massive set for the scene with London Bridge arching over the stage and what looked like real water flowing. And so it was part of the elaborate staging. So they put it front and centre. But its use in the publicity and its sort of prominence in the play, so I think tell you how conscious people were of Dickens's novels. They knew people who saw that knew exactly what that was without being told. They'd read the book, they knew what that was. And they knew about Nancy's Steps as well. It was already being talked about. And so you see it in the theatre. Of course, once films start getting made, this is the 1922 version of Oliver Twist with, Jackie Coonan and Lon Chaney as Fagin, I think. Here we have the tabard players again. A publicity photo on the actual steps. It's quite a cunning ruse. And then, of course, you get to more sort of loose adaptations of Dickens in that they don't rely on the real place, they build their own set. So this is David Lean's Oliver Twist, 1946. He didn't go to the real steps, he rebuilt them. And he does some really interesting, odd things, actually, with the London Bridge scenes. Look at the size of those stones. They're like the pyramids. That's not a London Bridge, that's massive. And he does the same thing again if you actually see the scene before this, when he's on the balustrade, when they're walking on the main bridge up top, and the balustrade of the bridge is like up to here on them. So they look like sort of tiny children. It's a very odd thing. I think it's just trying to create a sense of the uncanny, I guess, which is in the book very much. In the book, it's this slightly weird scene where the fog sort of rises from the river and London past merges with London present as well. But anyway, so we have all these films, we have these plays, Nancy's Steps, great. What happens, however, in the 60s? London Bridge takes a walk. London Bridge is demolished. London Bridge is sold to an American buyer and re-erected as a tourist attraction at Lake Havasu in Arizona. And that's where it stays today. So you might think that Nancy's Steps vanished in 1967 along with the bridge. And the answer is, well, kind of yes and no. If you go there today, you'll see an interesting plaque, which says, these steps and arch are surviving fragments of the 1831 London Bridge. I think that's probably correct. These steps were the scene of the murder of Nancy in Charles Dickens' novel, Oliver Twist. There's two problems with that. One, these aren't the steps. The real steps, which I know, if I can track back, the real steps go down to the river, right? These are waterside steps. These steps go down to Southwark Cathedral, and they're not overly large either. If you look at the steps as shown in the novel on the left here, you can see the width of them in that there's a boat pulled up them on the road. If you look at these steps, you wouldn't get boats up there, right? So these are not the steps. The original steps went down to the river. That was the point, right? You were getting towards the river and the dirt and the decay and the stench of the river as well. It's all part of a metaphor in the book as much as anything. And the other minor detail, of course, is in the novel, Nancy is not murdered on the steps. She's murdered at home. It's a really grisly scene of domestic violence in the sort of room shared by her and Bill Sykes. And so the plaque is kind of wholly wrong. But it's interesting that it's unofficial. It is not anyone's blue plaque. No one knows who put it there. It appeared in 2019, replacing an identically worded brown plaque, which was done by a Southwark Heritage group. That was either stolen or removed out of shame in about 2017, but someone replaced it, and it's probably the pub next door. We can't be absolutely sure. No one will admit to it. So we know why it's wrong, really. I mean, the reason it's wrong is the musical Oliver, right? If we've seen Oliver, Nancy's murdered there on London Bridge steps, because at the end of the musical, it's great, one of my favourite films, Lionel Bart, he's strung together various elements of Dickens' plot into one thing, and it's convenient to have a kill there in the music. It just works well. And so you could argue in a sense, if you want to be generous, you could argue in a sense it's not wholly misleading as sort of indicative, in that I think if we were to ask how many people here have read Oliver Twist from beginning to end and how many people have seen the musical Oliver, I guess the latter would win. And certainly in the general public, the latter would absolutely win, right? So in a sense, that particular adaptation of Dickens is certainly more well known. And you could argue, much like A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, those two books, they kind of transcended the origins in a way. We know the adaptations infinitely better than we know the originals. So I don't grudge this plaque being wrong. And if you really want to get sort of arty about it, yes, you could say there is in the original novel. The scene is a bit of a weird scene. Dickens conjures up sort of images of death and decay and the river, and he also harks back to Old London Bridge, the medieval London Bridge, when he's describing this scene. And that's because the medieval bridge, of course, was the site where they displayed traitors' heads. And this is the scene in the novel where Nancy is about to betray Fagin and Sykes. So he picks this scene very particularly, and he also tries to merge the past and the present in the novel in various ways. So this is sort of merging different, if you want to be generous. But okay, London Bridge, it's almost in the right place. I'm going to move on now to my final sort of point on this tour of slightly odd Dickens sites. A place called the Old Curiosity Shop. It's in Portsmouth Street, if you don't know it, near Lincoln's Inn Fields, off Kingsway. This is a particularly eerie glimpse in the background here from a photo in the Dickens Museum. I don't think this photo exists anywhere else. I like how the sort of bodies have got stretched, and I think that is genuine fog. We have genuine picture of fog here, folks. So the Old Curiosity Shop is a novel by Dickens. I should know the date. I want to say, well, it's about 1840, maybe 1841. 1840, it's not by Dickens. And he describes the shop, the Old Curiosity Shop. It's an antique shop, essentially. He describes it in the book thus. One of those receptacles for old and curious things which seem to crouch in odd corners of the town and to hide their musty treasures from the public eye in jealousy and distrust. There were suits of mail standing like ghosts in armour here and there, fantastic carvings brought from monkish cloisters, rusty weapons of various kinds, distorted figures in china and wood and iron and ivory, tapestry and strange furniture that might have been designed in dreams. I love that line, designed in dreams. But unfortunately, Dickens concludes the novel by stating that the shop in question has been demolished. And so, why are we looking at an old curiosity shop in central London to this day? The only clue to the shop's exterior in the book is essentially this illustration. And as you can see, it's showing sort of a very quaint and odd sort of maybe Jacobean porch with sort of a London townhouse behind it. Nothing like this building here. I'll show you a better picture of it later, but compare that to that. They don't look overly similar, do they? So we have, in the actual building that's supposedly survives, we have this sort of squat Tudor building with no resemblance to that illustration, nor any description in the novel, because Dickens essentially does not describe the front of the book in the novel. And yet, the old curiosity shop, until the opening of the Dickens Museum in 1925, was the Dickensian tourist destination. I mean, I can't tell you how famous it was. People come to London to see Buckingham Palace, Tower of London, and the old curiosity shop. If you look online for postcards on eBay, you will find hundreds of different photographs of it from like 1890 through to 1930. World's Fairs in the 1930s, it was part of the Merry England exhibition in the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, alongside the lights of the Tower of London and a recreated Shakespeare's Globe. It was one of those key destinations. If you were an American tourist coming to London, you would absolutely come and see the old curiosity shop. Why does that happen? As I say, it was partly thanks to Dickens' vagueness. There was a sense that pretty much every antique shop in London in the 1870s claimed to be the original of Dickens' old curiosity shop. But also, a certain Mr. Tessiman, who was the owner of the shop, had a cunning idea in the 1870s. He painted the words, the old curiosity shop, on the front of it in a sort of ornate Gothic script, which, you know, it's kind of a statement, isn't it? It then gets pictured in a US magazine in 1881. This thing on the left here, this is a very blurry copy of that magazine. And the author of that piece is writing about Dickens' tourism in 1881. He talks about there being a pardonable, albeit misguided desire on the part of this poverty-stricken neighbourhood to lift itself to an easy and inexpensive notoriety. So he said, this is a fake. He says it. It doesn't matter, because that looks like a really interesting building. And tourists start to come and visit it. And then the next owner of the building in the 1880s, Mr. Poole, he was a dealer in waste paper, but you could see the appeal of tourists coming to his property. He has the line below, immortalised by Charles Dickens. So there you have it, you know, the old curiosity shop, immortalised by Charles Dickens. It says what it does on the tin. And then it gets threatened with demolition in 1883, and the press go to town about it. This amazing old building, the old curiosity shop. Journalists talk about the crowds of American tourists outside. And this is supposedly a quote from an investigative, UK journalist who goes there to see what's happening. They went there to worship, a neighbouring shopkeeper said, took off their hats when they got through the doorway and asked questions about Quilp and the grandfather as if they'd been actual persons, so characters in the old curiosity shop. So he's saying tourists are coming along and asking, was this really where the characters in the book lived, The ladies were the worst. I've known them get down their knees and burst out crying about Little Nell. So were really dozens of American tourists bursting out crying about Little Nell in Portsmouth Street? I doubt it, but it makes for good copy, right? By the way, we always laugh at Americans being interested in Dickens' tourist sites. It goes right back. Why was it so fascinating? I think one reason, is it just looked old. So that sounds really boring. It looked old. I think it met a certain set of expectations about what Old England and Old London and Dickens meant in sort of the 1880s, 1890s. This is an advert from the international edition of the Daily Mail, which was sold, I think, exclusively on Cunard liners going from the States through to London. And it gives you an idea of what people coming to the UK were looking for in terms of tourism. I think it says something somewhere like this storied country, this country full of you know, and you've got the land of Dickens, the land of Troll, and, you know, along with knights in armour, medieval castles, you name it. So Dickens was already part of a kind of UK tourist brand, and the Old Curiosity Shop kind of fitted in with that. The sort of crooked appearance was also really appealing to people. Henry James, the American author, once said that it was England's crooked ancient buildings that produced such a vigorous imagination in the likes of writers like Dickens. And Dickens might have actually agreed. When he went to the States in the 1840s, publicising his work on a sort of grand tour, he gets to Philadelphia, this new-built American city, all linear, all grid patterned, barely a few years old. He says, "I would have given the world for a crooked street." Or I think he says also, or an old graveyard. So it shows how Dickens himself was, affected by these things. And I think the other thing about the Old Curiosity Shop, it was sufficiently out of the way. It wasn't on a main road, so you had to make some effort to find it. So it chimed in with the sort of labyrinthine feel of Dickens London as well. It doesn't resemble anything mentioned in the Old Curiosity Shop. It does resemble more, if you read the book Dombey and Son, there's an old shop in there in the city. And if you look at the illustration of that, that looks rather like the Old Curiosity Shop. So it's Dickensian in that broadest sense possible, I guess. Fixing them up. And just also, if you look at it, it's kind of a quaint, compact, small building that stood out. It stood out even in the 1880s from everything around it, because it was a genuinely Tudor building. It did go back hundreds of years. And because of that sort of quaint, compact appearance, it also started to be marketed. From the very earliest, they were selling wooden blocks with the front painted on, which you could buy for twopence. I think twopence plain and maybe fourpence coloured, And later on, you see it made into things like honey pots, door knockers, mustard tins, all in the shape of the Old Curiosity Shop. So, the sort of collectible you could get today from if you go to sort of Shakespeare's, Anne Hathaway's cottage or what have you. And the other thing, of course, I think which made it really attractive, I've sort of already alluded to it, that frontage. It says on the thing, the Old Curiosity Shop, immortalised by Charles Dickens. It's like the title page of a book. It's really telling you what it is, right? And of course, it starts appearing like London Bridge Steps did. It starts appearing elsewhere. So this is the 1924 sort of Dickens London, the tour of Dickens London. And it uses the shop front. These are sort of transparent ghost-like figures of little Nell and her grandfather, characters from the novel. And they sort of waft across the flame in this tour of Dickens London. I don't know if you can't really make out the windows in detail, but actually if you look at it, what it's showing you in the windows is drawings of the Old Curiosity Shop, which you could buy from the Old Curiosity Shop, right? So, and it carries on. So this is the Tabard Players again. I think one year only, they did the Old Curiosity Shop outside the Old Curiosity Shop, which of course is a fabulous idea. And then what do we have next? Let's have a look. Oh, and then yes, so I mentioned earlier that it was recreated at the Chicago World's Fair. And this is it on the left. This is a group of the Dickensian fans, the Dickens Fellowship, I don't know which branch from America, I imagine, lining up outside a recreation of the Old Curiosity Shop. And you can see on the right there how it fitted into a broader sort of Disney-like streetscape of old London and the Tower of London, and the Old Curiosity Shop was right in there. The shop's sort of fame, it diminished, I think, after Dickens Museum opens. That becomes like an alternative place of pilgrimage. And I was talking to someone whose family used to run it in the 80s, and I think it was when Camden Council banned coaches from Lincoln's Inn Fields, and that killed their business as a tourist destination, basically, around about sort of 1990 or thereabouts. I think I've still got another picture. Let's see. Oh yeah, so this is it remade, or at least, tarted up. It's owned by London School of Economics. They have basically tried to remodel it according to some of the colouring from the paintwork that existed, and the inscription, by the way, has been done about in 6 different ways over the years since it was first drawn. It's been repainted several times. And they kept the crooked roof. I did go inside at one point. It looks like a genuinely old Tudor building inside. It's fascinating. People have complained it looks too new. But, what you're going to do? Although in the window is a picture of a 1920s picture of the Old Curiosity Shop saying, what are we going to do now with the Old Curiosity Shop? And of course, in that picture, in the window of the picture, is a picture, it's like an infinite regression. So what does this all amount to? I'm drawing to a close, you'd be grateful to know. What does this tell us about why people have been visiting Dickens London? obviously, you know, the overall history is a history of hero worship, right? People started off certainly being immense fans of Dickens personally. This was the end of the 19th century. It was very much a sort of great man theory of history, and he was one of those great figures of English life. And, you know, I think we still hold some of that today. We know a lot more about his personal life today, which casts some of that into doubt, but he's, you know, an amazing literary figure. It comes at a time when literary tourism was really booming. People were going to the Lake District to look at, you know, Wordsworth, Lake District, and so on, Walter Scott, Scotland, you name it. The Victorians also were generally kind of fascinated, originally, sort of the past, recreating the past, seeing the past, and we are to this day, I think. And of course, you know, ultimately, all this is testimony to the power of Dickens' writing, right? It's the vivid descriptions in the books which make people want to go back to the real world place and sort of check it against it. Does it look like what he said in the books? And I kind of think almost the real world places are kind of like another type of illustration, actually. If you've read the book, certainly, I think the place actually is not kind of the original. If it is the original Dickens used, it's also like an illustration. So you have this idea in your head and then you compare it to, like, it could be another drawing or another representation. It's just like kind of one of many possibilities. I don't know. I mean, does it matter that some of these famous sites were the products of at least wishful thinking, and in this case, kind of pretty much made up? I think it depends on whether you value authenticity, historical authenticity, or imagination. And actually, tourists tend to prefer imagination. But it doesn't really matter. You know, Dickens survives to this day. I don't think it matters if this is real or fake. We'll still want to know about his work, I think, for decades and decades to come. And if it introduces people to that work or lets them think about it in a different way, I'm very, very happy with that. So thank you for coming. I hope that's introduced Dickens London to you. Okay, thank you. So yeah. Any questions? I need my other glasses for questions. Hang on, this is very important. Right, there we go. Yes, now I can see the audience. That's good. That's good.
Hi, that was really interesting, thank you. I'm just wondering, because obviously a lot of interest in Dickens now is the places where he lived, the old prison, is it Marshalsea Prison?
Marshalsea Prison, yeah.
And the endless amount of pubs that are linked to him. Were these tourists also, did they also go and look at the Dickens' personal locations?
Not so much. Partly so there was a problem with getting plaques on houses originally. It was originally the Royal Society of Arts who did the Blue Plaque scheme. So you know the famous Blue Plaques you see all over London. The Royal Society of Arts was this body interested in innovation in art and technology who were involved in the Crystal Palace, but they also got involved in this idea of having plaques to famous people in London. They came up with the idea in the 1860s, but originally one of the problems was people didn't want the plaques on their houses because people didn't want gaggles of tourists coming to find where Dickens lived. So the one in Doughty Street, which is now the museum, didn't have a plaque till, I think, the early 1900s. So the first 30 years, no, they weren't very interested. Where did get plaques originally, where Dickens lived? Not Staples Inn. What's the inn? Someone tell me. Staples Inn. Say again? Furnival Inn. Furnival Inn. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Brain gone. Furnival's Inn. Dickens lived in a building called Furnival's Inn in the 1820s, just before he got married and shortly just after he got married. And by the 1870s, that had become a hotel. And so the hotel manager was really keen to commemorate the fact that Dickens lived there, right? Because the tourists came there. But I mean, in terms of Dickens' houses in London, the first plaque goes up on Doughty Street, I think it's sort of 1905, something. I may be wrong, it's in the book, but early 1900, first decade. The other houses, well, one had been demolished, so the house near Euston, that had already been demolished by about sort of 1900. There was a house opposite Regent's Park. He had a big Devonshire Terrace, I want to call it. I think that's right. That was still there, but there was not much attention. His personal life, strangely enough, his personal life seemed to get less attention, and his places of residence got less attention than the places in the fiction, which is unusual, because normally you go to the author's house, which is this place where he created. I think it's partly that Dickens was really mobile, right? So he had three major houses in London that you could have picked, none of them that necessarily outshone the others. And at the end of the life, of course, he'd moved to Kent, Gad's Hill Place, which his son bought in 1870 when he died, but then had to give up in 1879 because he couldn't afford it, and then it became into private hands, and there's a whole history around that. But yeah, Dickens is odd, that actually the places in the books get more attention than the places he lived. The Marshalsea, yes, to some extent, right? So his father was imprisoned in the Marshalsea in 1824, and he writes about it in Little Dorrit. People did have a look there, and there was like a factory building there by the 1880s. That was one of the places, but yeah, no, his biography gets less attention. Even when John Forster brings out his biography really early after his death, telling all these details, his biographical places get a little less attention. I think because there's so much to choose from with Dickens, right? There's hundreds of locations you could have chosen.
Thank you. Yeah, again, a part of what I was going to ask, he sort of almost asked as well. But it's very interesting is that the Marshalsea connection, because there is a plaque in the alleyway next to the library that says that this was effectively the place of the debtor's prison. And so as a child, I think he sort of lived quite nearby at times because his father was there.
Very nearby.
And the name of the street escapes me because when I was doing some family history, I found out that my great-grandfather was living in the same street that Dickens was in, maybe just for a few months. But also there is a lot of that run, and I love that. I think about every time I walk past that little plaque, I think about that. And I said, but they're down to the river. But when it's a dark, cold, sort of foggy, damp night, the atmosphere is,
Yeah, I mean, Southwark still has, I mean, this is what we're talking about with the coaching inns, right? Okay, it's not the actual inn, but it still takes you back in time, I think.
Exactly, and I think as around sort of Mint Street as well, and it's a very sort of, it was a slum area, obviously.
Absolutely, a very poor area.
In that era. And so is that because they've now, the council have now sort of, there is a sort of a Dickens sort of walk in that area?
There are actually, I'm trying to remember the Marshall. I think there's two different sets of, at least two different sets of sort of plaques put up to the Marshalsea in that, I think it's Angel Place, the alley next to it. And when originally it was a factory there, and they had a large sign put up on the side of the factory. This was like 1880s or something. This is the Marshalsea prison of Dickens's. And so it lingered in bits and pieces for quite a while. But I think even when Dickens goes there in the 1850s, so during his own lifetime, he says it's nothing like it was. And you've got to remember that so much of Dickens' London was destroyed or changed or demolished during his actual lifetime, let alone, because he tends to write about the London of his childhood. He writes about the London when he first encounters it in the 1820s. And even his later books, they all really smack of 1820s, maybe 1830s London, much less than when they're written. And the Fleet Prison in Pickwick Papers, demolished 10 years after Dickens writes about it, I think, something like that, right? So, in a sense, they start when Dickens is, it depends what you mean, right? I mean, slum clearances is by local councils. They start when we have like a system of local authorities, or, the first sort of London-wide council is 1889. So, you can go back further. And there's always, as I said in that quote originally, the mania for improvement and, knocking things down. That goes back to the very beginning. So yeah, it's all there. It's all there in Dickens. Any other questions? Sorry, is the lady at the back there? Or?
Hi, thank you. Just wondered, is Dickens tourism still a big thing now? I mean, with Americans particularly?
It's not as big as it was, I think. I'm not a tour guide, so there's certainly some people who do it full time. Still, there's a couple of people who do it full time, I think. The main thing now. Does anyone want to guess what the main London tourism is now? Harry Potter. There we go. I saw an advert recently for a tour guide to take groups around London who needed to cover two things: the Harry Potter experience in Watford and the Jack the Ripper Museum. And Jack the Ripper is still bigger than Dickens, I think, these days. Yeah, I don't think it's going to come back in a big way. I think Harry Potter's taken over. But it's exactly the same principle, right? You read these places in the book, you have this imaginary world in your head, and you can go and stand there in the real imagined place. It's kind of weird. It's exactly the same idea. Sorry, you had a question also. Sorry.
As I was hearing you talk, did everybody, especially the American tourists, realize this was fiction and weren't necessarily physical places that were being depicted? It might have been from Dickens' imagination. It seems like an odd thing to want to find the physical location of a book of fiction.
Yeah, I mean that's the real quantity. First of all, the question is, did people realise that these were, not that fiction is fiction, right? I think sometimes there was a playfulness to it, right? So I think sometimes the landlords of these pubs were conjuring up this sort of jokey idea that this was a real place, and equally the tourists were playing along, right? And I think I think I've done that sort of thing on holiday where someone sort of says, you're not quite sure if it's true, but you go along with it. You're having a good time. You had a couple of drinks. I think in some cases, it's always been a joke about Dickens fans that they're really obsessive. And that, again, goes right back to the Victorian period, that they believe as if it was real, and that is said of Dickens fans more than anyone else. I don't know, really. I don't know. What does it... And it's a question, and I can't answer it. I think there will be some people who if you read these articles that people wrote, they always say, oh yeah, there were some fools who think this is all real, and there's someone who went into the bar and asked to be, I don't know. I think often it's a joke against Americans, I'm sorry to say, not always, but also just a joke. And it's that because we have quite an insecurity that we're kind of selling out our cultural heritage to other people, and it's the same with Shakespeare. But the other question, the more general question was, so tell me, what was your second part of the question? I'm losing my...
Everybody realized it.
Yeah, no, I think people realise, but you also, it's sort of the broader question is, does it matter almost? Because I think the conclusion I kind of come to is that it all brings you back to Dickens in the end, right? And you've got that amazing body of work there. And to my mind, I think if you've read that body of work, it kind of illustrates. Think of it as illustration, which is not quite fiction or non-fiction. It's kind of just, it's another way of seeing it. The same way like a film adaptation is another way of seeing it. I don't know. I don't think people were fools in the past, But, I did this talk at Southwark Cathedral a few months ago. And again, someone quite annoyed got that. So, I was on a tour the other day, and someone told me that Dickens used to stand up and read his books at the George Inn to an assembled crowd. I'm like, no, that was just purely made up. But Dickens did give readings of his books in nice theatres and music all the way. So things get blurred and confused. And I think that's just nature of history as well. So if you want to know more, it's all in the book. But,
Thank you very much, everyone. Please join me in thanking Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.